This resource video will provide you with an overview of the Title I Part A Schoolwide Program Plan or Campus Improvement Plan stakeholder requirement being monitored as part of the 2022-2023 random validation process conducted by the Federal Program Compliance Division. Each LEA selected to participate in the random validation process for the Title I Part A program was provided with the name of one school-wide program campus. The LEA will be responsible for submitting the documentation requested for only that one school-wide program campus. Documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. To ensure the overall compliance with program requirements, LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. The documentation requested for submission during the random validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. The Title I Part A statute specifies that the school-wide program plan must be developed with the involvement of parents and other members of the community to be served, as well as individuals who will carry out the plan, including teachers, principals, other school leaders, paraprofessionals, administrators, including administrators of the Title I Part C and Title I Part D programs if the LEA has those programs, LEA administrators, tribes and tribal organizations if present in the community, and if appropriate, specialized instructional support personnel, technical assistance providers, school staff, students if the plan relates to a secondary school, and other individuals determined by the school. The first item of documentation that is required is the relevant page or pages from the current school year's Campus Improvement Plan that includes a list of the stakeholders involved in the development of the plan. The stakeholder listing shall include the individuals by name and the stakeholder group that each individual represents. Please remember that parents may not be LEA employees in order to fill the parent roles on the committee. Please also note that the statutory language includes plural references, which means that there would need to be more than one stakeholder involved for the groups referenced. During our review, we will particularly be looking for the following required groups of stakeholders: parents, other members of the community to be served, teachers, principals, other school leaders, and paraprofessionals present in the school, administrators of the Title I Part C and Title I Part D programs, tribes and tribal organizations present in the community, and if the plan relates to a secondary school, students. For the CIP Item 1.1 documentation required, there are several issues that may result in the LEA receiving an improvement needed status. The LEA should be aware of these potential issues as it prepares its documentation for submission. Potential issues include that the auditable documentation requested was not submitted. Another potential issue is that the documentation submitted did not include the individual stakeholders by name. Another potential issue is that the documentation submitted did not include the stakeholder roles for each individual stakeholder listed, for us to be able to make a determination if the campus met statutory requirements. Additionally, another issue is that prior year documentation was submitted instead of current year documentation. The documentation required for the CIP items 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4 includes meeting agendas, meeting minutes or notes, and participant rosters or sign-in sheets for one meeting held during the campus planning process, documenting the involvement of the required stakeholders in the development of the school-wide program plan. Although it is highly unlikely that the CIP development process would take place in one meeting, considering that the process should be comprehensive in nature, we are only requesting the documentation for one meeting. The documentation submitted should provide evidence that the CIP stakeholders listed in the documentation referenced in CIP Item 1.1 were involved in the CIP development process. The standard documentation for a meeting includes a meeting agenda, meeting notes or minutes, and sign-in sheets or participant rosters that indicate attendance. These are the items that we will be examining as 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4. The meeting agenda from the campus planning process should provide evidence that the required stakeholders were involved in the development of the school-wide program plan. The meeting notes or minutes should align with a list of stakeholders involved. They should also provide evidence that the required stakeholders were involved in the development of the school-wide program plan. The participant roster or sign-in sheet showing the attendance should include the meeting title, the meeting date, the stakeholder names and roles of the stakeholders involved. Documentation for virtual meetings is acceptable. Given the increased use of virtual meeting environments, participant rosters that include the meeting title, meeting date, and the stakeholder names and roles for participants would be acceptable substitutes for the more traditional sign-in sheets. This eliminates the need of a participant signature for virtual meetings. This chart shows which details are required for different types of meeting documentation and which are considered best practice. For example, the agenda is required to have the meeting title, the campus name, the date, and the time of the meeting. It's a best practice to include the location. Meeting notes or minutes should include the meeting title, the campus name, and the date and the time of the meeting. It's a best practice to include the location of the meeting and the names and roles of the stakeholders involved. The participant roster should include the meeting title, the campus name, the date and time of the meeting, and the stakeholder names and roles. It's a best practice to include the location. Parents may not be LEA employees in order to fulfill the parent roles on the committee. For the CIP items 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4, there are several issues that may result in the LEA receiving an improvement needed status. The LEA should be aware of these potential issues as they prepare their documentation for submission. Potential issues include that auditable documentation requested was not submitted. Another potential issue is that the documentation submitted does not reference the CIP development process. An LEA should make every effort to ensure that their documentation submitted, such as the meeting agendas, meeting minutes, or notes, should make reference to the CIP development process. Another potential issue is the documentation submitted does not align with the list of stakeholders that was submitted to meet the CIP item 1.1. Finally, another issue is that the prior year documentation was submitted instead of the current year documentation. Questions related to this random validation for Title I Part A may be referred to Jaime Huerta or Vivian Smurl at essasupport@tea.texas.gov.